June 13, 2005. Michael Jackson sat inside a California courtroom, waiting to find out whether he'd walk out the front door or be taken into custody. Outside, the scene looked like it belonged in a movie nobody would believe. Fans sobbing behind barricades, television crews from 6 continents broadcasting live. Reporters holding 2 completely different headlines, one for guilty, one for not, ready to publish whichever one the jury chose. But inside that courtroom, there was no music, no stage, no roaring crowd, no spotlight, just 12 jurors, a judge, and 10 criminal counts that could send the most famous entertainer alive to prison. Then the clerk began to read, "Not guilty," another count, "Not guilty," then another, and another, and another, until every single charge had received the same 2 words, "Not guilty." Michael Jackson had survived a 14-week trial that had dragged the most private, most controversial, and most damaging allegations of his life into open court. But the verdict didn't end the argument. It deepened it, because only months earlier, prosecutors had walked into that courtroom believing they could prove their case. They had a teenage accuser who said Michael Jackson had molested him. They had the boy's family backing up the story. They had former Neverland employees willing to testify about what they claimed to have seen. They had evidence seized during a police search of the ranch, and they had a judge's permission to reach into the 1990s and bring older allegations into the same courtroom. At times during the trial, the case looked devastating. Then the defense attorney started cross-examining the witnesses, and something shifted. Dates stopped lining up. Stories changed under pressure. Motives were questioned. One prosecution claim was contradicted by nothing more than a publication date printed on a magazine. Celebrity witnesses appeared to deny allegations made by former employees, and the accuser's own mother, one of the prosecution's most important witnesses, became one of the defense's most effective weapons. For 14 weeks, the jury was shown 2 completely different versions of Michael Jackson, one built by the prosecution, one dismantled by the defense. The world had already chosen sides long before the trial started. The jury couldn't. They had to answer one question: had the prosecution actually proved what it charged Michael Jackson with doing? To understand why 12 people answered no 10 times, we have to go back to a television documentary that turned a global superstar into a criminal defendant. In February 2003, British journalist Martin Bashir aired a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson. Jackson had agreed to let Bashir spend months filming parts of his private life. He apparently believed the documentary would show people who he really was, the person behind the headlines, the man the tabloids had been building myths about for years. Instead, one sequence overwhelmed almost everything else in the film. Jackson was shown sitting beside a young cancer survivor named Gavin Arvizo. They held hands on camera, and Jackson spoke openly about allowing children to sleep in his bedroom. He insisted there was nothing sexual about it. In his explanation, sharing a bedroom was an act of affection and generosity, and he argued that other people were projecting something ugly onto behavior he considered innocent. Once those images reached television screens, the reaction was immediate and enormous. For many viewers, Jackson's explanation didn't make the situation less uncomfortable. It made it harder to understand. And suddenly, a private practice Jackson had openly defended was being debated by millions of people who had never set foot inside Neverland. But here's the detail that would later matter inside a courtroom. The boy sitting beside Jackson in that documentary didn't appear afraid of him. He appeared close to him. He had survived serious illness. Jackson had helped his family, and the relationship was publicly described, by the family themselves, as loving and supportive. After the documentary exploded into worldwide controversy, Jackson's team moved to contain the damage. A second video was recorded. This time, the Arvizo family appeared on camera and praised Jackson. They called him generous, compassionate, fatherly, a blessing to their family. Later, prosecutors would argue those statements had been coerced, that the family was pressured into making the video while Jackson's associates controlled their movements. The defense would argue the opposite, that the video proved how dramatically the family's story changed once they saw an opportunity. That contradiction would sit at the center of the entire trial, because within months of praising Michael Jackson on camera, the boy seen holding his hand on television accused him of molestation. The story was no longer about whether Jackson's behavior seemed unusual. It was about whether a crime had been committed, and on November 18, 2003, police vehicles pulled up to the gates of Neverland. Neverland had always existed as Michael Jackson's private world, thousands of acres in California's Santa Ynez Valley, a theater, rides, animals, arcades, everything designed to look less like an adult celebrity's estate and more like the childhood Jackson often said he'd been denied. Then investigators arrived with search warrants. The images traveled around the world within hours. 2 days later, Jackson was arrested. He denied the allegations and was released on $3 million bail. That moment changed the stakes completely. Michael Jackson had been accused before. The 1993 allegations had produced an investigation and a civil settlement, but no criminal charges, no trial, and no conviction. This time was different. This time, prosecutors were preparing to put him in front of a jury. A grand jury indicted him. By early 2005, the case was ready. On one side, Santa Barbara County District Attorney Tom Sneddon, who had also been involved in the 1993 investigation. A prosecutor who had been waiting over a decade for another chance at Michael Jackson. On the other, defense attorney Thomas Mesereau, tall, silver-haired, methodical, and relentless in cross-examination. Mesereau would become nearly as central to the courtroom story as the witnesses themselves. Jackson's future now depended on 12 ordinary people from a California farming community, people who would have to weigh evidence that millions of strangers around the world had already made up their minds about. And when the trial opened in Santa Maria, it became immediately clear that nothing about this case would feel ordinary. Santa Maria wasn't Los Angeles. It wasn't New York or London. But for 4 months in 2005, this quiet California community became one of the most watched places on the planet. Fans gathered outside the courthouse every single day. Some carried signs declaring Jackson's innocence. Others traveled thousands of miles just to see him arrive. Television crews positioned cameras at every angle. Reporters analyzed his clothing, his facial expressions, his family members, his physical condition, even the speed at which he walked from his SUV to the courthouse door. Then, on February 28, 2005, opening statements began. And once those courtroom doors closed, the spectacle was supposed to stop mattering. Because the jury's job wasn't to decide whether Michael Jackson was strange, it wasn't to decide whether they liked his music, it wasn't even to decide whether they personally approved of an adult man allowing unrelated children to sleep in his bedroom. The legal question was narrower and far more difficult. Prosecutors had brought 10 criminal counts. They had to prove them, beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction, the gap between "this looks wrong" and "this has been proven," would become the most important fault line of the entire trial. Because the prosecution wasn't about to present Michael Jackson as an eccentric celebrity who exercised terrible judgment. They were about to present him as a predator, and the evidence they brought was designed to make 12 jurors believe it. The prosecution's theory centered on what happened in the months after the Bashir documentary. The charges were severe: 4 counts alleging lewd acts upon a child under 14, 1 count of attempted lewd conduct, 4 counts alleging Jackson provided alcohol to a minor to assist in committing molestation, and 1 conspiracy count, the broadest charge, involving allegations of child abduction, false imprisonment, and extortion. The prosecution argued that Jackson had developed an inappropriate relationship with Gavin Arvizo after befriending the boy during his cancer treatment, that he molested him at Neverland, that alcohol was provided, and that after the Bashir documentary triggered a worldwide backlash, people in Jackson's inner circle worked to keep the Arvizo family contained, held at the ranch, controlled, and pressured into producing the video that praised Jackson on camera. That conspiracy allegation expanded the case far beyond what allegedly happened in a bedroom. The prosecution wanted the jury to believe that Jackson's organization had something to hide, and that they had taken steps to hide it. The accuser's sister testified that the family had been watched and prevented from leaving freely. The accuser's mother made similar claims, and comedian Louise Palanker told the court she received a phone call from the mother during that period that alarmed her. But the prosecution had a problem that surfaced almost immediately. The same family now describing fear and captivity had previously appeared on camera praising Jackson in warm, emotional terms. The jury had seen that tape. They'd watched the mother call Jackson a blessing. They'd watched the children speak about him with affection. And the trial began tilting toward one question that cut against both sides equally. Who was telling the truth? The family on the praise tape or the family on the witness stand? Because the answer to that question was about to become far more complicated. In March 2005, Gavin Arvizo entered the courtroom. He was 15 now, but he was describing events he said happened when he was 13. Michael Jackson sat only a short distance away. By multiple accounts, there was almost no visible interaction between them. The boy told the jury that there had been a time when Jackson felt almost impossibly important to him. He described Jackson as having been like his best friend, someone who paid attention to him, who helped his family, who made him feel special at the lowest point of his life. Then he testified that the relationship changed. He alleged that Jackson molested him at Neverland. For prosecutors, this was the human center of the entire case. The jury was no longer listening to lawyers describe allegations in legal language. The boy himself was saying it happened. Then Thomas Messereau stood up, and the cross-examination that followed became one of the defining sequences of the trial. Messereau tested the account from every angle: dates, timelines, what the boy had told other people, what he'd initially denied, how many times certain events had supposedly occurred, whether his story stayed consistent when the same question arrived from a different direction. The defense wanted the jury to see testimony that shifted every time pressure was applied. There were difficult moments on both sides. The prosecution's own experts acknowledged inconsistencies in the accuser's account, but explained that inconsistency doesn't necessarily mean a child abuse allegation is false. A person describing abuse may delay disclosure. Memory may be imperfect. Embarrassment and fear may change how someone tells a story. But Messereau hammered the other side of that principle just as hard. Inconsistency alone doesn't prove an accusation is true, either. And these 12 jurors still had to decide whether this particular witness was reliable enough to support a criminal conviction. Then the accuser's younger brother took the stand, and one small moment became one of the most talked about details of the entire trial. The brother testified that Jackson had shown the boys adult magazines from a briefcase. Messereau pointed to one of the publications being entered into evidence. Its date was August 2003. The incident the witness was describing had allegedly happened months earlier. A publication date, something printed on paper, something that couldn't change its story under cross-examination, didn't fit the testimony. Now, this wasn't a courtroom where every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. Prosecutors later presented fingerprint evidence involving adult magazines found in Jackson's bedroom, including one bearing prints attributed to both Jackson and the accuser. One fact looked damaging for the defense. Another raised doubt about the prosecution. One witness sounded convincing on direct examination. Then cross-examination pulled a thread. That pattern, evidence cutting both ways, certainty dissolving into complexity, defined the entire 14 weeks. And then, on a morning that should have been about testimony, something happened that became almost as famous as anything said inside that courtroom. March 10, 2005. Court was scheduled to begin. Jackson's seat was empty. The judge waited. The jury waited. The prosecution waited. Messereau told Judge Rodney Melville that Jackson was suffering from severe back pain and had been taken for medical treatment. Judge Melville was not interested in celebrity explanations. He issued a warning that if Jackson didn't appear, a bench warrant would be issued for his arrest. His $3 million bail, the only thing standing between Michael Jackson and a jail cell, was suddenly at risk. Then Jackson arrived. He was assisted toward the courthouse, moving slowly, visibly in pain. He wore a jacket over a t-shirt, and beneath the jacket, pajama bottoms. The photographs were everywhere within minutes. For much of the watching world, the trial had crossed into something almost surreal, the king of pop. A criminal courtroom, pajama pants. The image became one of the defining visual memories of the entire case, not because it proved anything about guilt or innocence, but because it showed something the public had rarely seen from Michael Jackson, a man who wasn't in control of the room. For decades, Jackson had controlled every detail of his public appearances, the lighting, the timing, the choreography, the entrance. Inside this courtroom, he controlled almost nothing. Judge Melville decided when court began. The prosecution decided which witnesses appeared. The jury decided what mattered. And on this particular morning, Jackson's own body had nearly prevented him from being there at all. He took his seat. The accuser's testimony continued, and the trial moved forward, because the courtroom didn't wait for Michael Jackson to be ready. And the next decision from Judge Melville would make Jackson's legal position significantly more dangerous, because prosecutors were about to reach backward, past the Bashir documentary, past the praise tape, past 2003 entirely, into the 1990s. On March 28th, Judge Melville handed the prosecution a major victory. He ruled that evidence involving earlier allegations of inappropriate sexual conduct with other boys could be introduced in this trial. These were not convictions. Some had never resulted in criminal charges. Jackson had consistently denied abusing children, but California law allowed certain evidence of previous alleged misconduct to be considered in sex crime prosecutions. For Tom Sneddon, this changed the shape of the case entirely. The prosecution no longer had to present the 2003 allegations in isolation. They could argue that what Gavin Arvizo described fit a pattern, that this wasn't the first time, that there had been others. Former Neverland employees took the stand. They described relationships Jackson had with boys who spent time at the ranch. Some made serious allegations about what they claimed to have witnessed. One former employee testified to seeing highly explicit conduct involving another boy. Another person from Jackson's past testified that Jackson had touched him inappropriately when he was a child. This was some of the most disturbing testimony the jury heard during the entire trial. But Mesereau went after the people delivering it with the same precision he'd applied to the Arvizo family. Some former employees had sued Jackson. Some had financial disputes with him. Some had sold stories to tabloids. Some had histories the defense argued gave them clear motives to exaggerate or fabricate. And here the jury faced one of the hardest tasks of the entire trial. Maybe the hardest task any jury in a case like this has to perform. They couldn't simply say, "There are many allegations, so they must be true." But they also couldn't say, "No earlier allegation resulted in a conviction, so none of this matters." They had to evaluate each witness individually. Each motive, each contradiction, each claim against whatever evidence existed to support or undermine it. And they had to do that while the most famous face in the world sat silently at the defense table, watching. The prosecution believed bringing Jackson's past into the courtroom would reveal a pattern too clear for any jury to ignore. The defense believed it gave them even more witnesses with questionable motives to take apart on cross-examination. By early May, after weeks of testimony, the prosecution rested its case, and the reaction among people watching from inside that courtroom was far from unanimous about where things stood. On May 4th, prosecutors rested their main case. Jurors had heard weeks of allegations by this point. They'd heard from the accuser, his siblings, his mother, former Neverland employees, investigators, experts, and people connected to older accusations. There had been evidence the defense couldn't simply wave away, but there had also been repeated credibility problems that had surfaced on cross-examination and hung in the air every time the prosecution's witnesses left the stand. The accuser had contradicted himself on details. His brother had been confronted with the magazine date inconsistency. The accuser's mother had become a central target of Mesereau's questioning, and several of her answers had visibly damaged the atmosphere in the courtroom. Some former employees had complicated financial histories with Jackson that the defense had laid bare. Even courtroom reporters who had covered the trial from the beginning were openly asking whether the prosecution had established enough to get past reasonable doubt. That didn't mean Jackson had won. Judge Melville rejected the defense's motion to dismiss the charges outright. The case was going forward. But Mesereau now had an advantage the prosecution never could have had. He'd spent weeks watching the government's entire strategy unfold. He'd seen every witness. He'd heard every answer. He knew exactly where the cracks were, and he was about to build his defense directly on top of those cracks, starting with the prosecution's most damaging suggestion that boys who slept in Michael Jackson's bed were therefore victims of abuse. Mesereau opened his case with two young Australian men who had known Jackson as children. They testified that they had spent nights with him, and they told the jury plainly that nothing sexual had ever happened. Their purpose was clear. Prosecution witnesses had made allegations involving some of Jackson's young companions. The defense could now put those same kinds of relationships before the jury through people who said the accusations were wrong, people who were there, who would have been the victims if the allegations were true, and who were saying it never happened. That didn't logically prove that no other child could have been harmed. Mesereau didn't need it to. His strategy was about breaking the prosecution's pattern argument at its foundation. If former employees claimed they witnessed Jackson behave sexually with certain boys, and those boys themselves sat in the witness chair and denied it, how much weight should the jury give those employees? Then the defense called a witness whose name alone changed the energy in the courtroom, Macaulay Culkin, one of the biggest child stars of the 1990s, a former close friend of Michael Jackson, someone whose name had appeared in the prosecution's case because former employees had alleged seeing Jackson touch him inappropriately. Culkin walked into that courtroom and told the jury it never happened. He acknowledged that as a boy, he had slept in Jackson's bed. He didn't deny the friendship or its closeness, but he said, directly, clearly, without hedging, that Jackson had never molested him. He described their relationship as partly built around something very few people on Earth could understand, what it felt like to become extraordinarily famous while still a child. His testimony directly contradicted former employees who had claimed otherwise. The jury now had to decide, do we believe the alleged victim, who says nothing happened? Or do we believe third-party witnesses who claim they saw something the alleged victim himself denies? Then came Jay Leno. The defense brought him in, hoping his contact with the Arvizo family would help establish that they had a pattern of approaching celebrities. Leno testified that phone calls from the boy had struck him as unusually effusive, but Leno also acknowledged the boy hadn't directly asked him for money, a limitation the defense had to live with, because even your own witnesses don't always give you everything you want. Then Chris Tucker took the stand. Tucker had befriended the Arvizo family after learning about Gavin's illness. He'd helped them financially, but he told the jury that over time, he became suspicious of the family's motives. His testimony helped the defense argue that concerns about the family's behavior hadn't been invented after the accusations. They'd existed long before. By this point, roughly 140 witnesses had been part of the trial record. Macaulay Culkin, Jay Leno, Chris Tucker, former employees, police officers, family members, forensic experts. It was one of the most sprawling witness lists in California criminal trial history. But the one person everyone had been waiting to hear from still hadn't said a word, Michael Jackson himself. And the question of whether he would take the stand became one of the most dramatic decisions of the entire case. At the beginning of the trial, Mesereau had strongly suggested Jackson might testify. That possibility hung over the courtroom for weeks. Think about what that would have meant. Michael Jackson, sitting in the witness chair, looking directly at the jury, denying everything in his own words. The human being behind the celebrity, finally speaking for himself inside the one room where what he said carried legal weight. But testimony is a door that swings both ways. If Jackson took the stand, he could deny the allegations. He could explain Neverland. He could describe his relationships with children in his own language. And then Tom Sneddon would be allowed to question him. About sleepovers. About the documentary. About why he thought sharing a bed with unrelated children was appropriate. About the 1993 allegations. About the settlement. about every strange statement Jackson had ever made in a public interview, about things he'd said to Bashir on camera that millions of people had found impossible to defend. Every uncomfortable moment of Michael Jackson's public life could have become the starting point of a prosecution question. And one wrong answer, one moment of confusion, one flash of the eccentricity the world had debated for years, could have undone everything the defense had spent weeks building. Mesereau made the safer legal choice. The defense rested without calling Michael Jackson to the stand. That decision said something fundamental about how criminal law works, something most people watching from outside the courtroom didn't fully appreciate. Jackson didn't have to prove he was innocent. He didn't have to explain every unusual decision he'd ever made. He didn't have to persuade 12 jurors that his behavior with children was normal. He didn't have to say a single word in his own defense. The burden belonged entirely to the prosecution. Tom Sneddon and his team had to prove the charged crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. And if they hadn't, if the evidence left room for uncertainty, then the jury's duty was to acquit, regardless of whether they personally found Jackson's lifestyle troubling. After 14 weeks, both sides now had one final chance to tell the jury what all of this evidence meant. If you've made it this far, and you're starting to understand why this trial was so much more complicated than the headlines made it seem, subscribe to this channel. Because every story we tell here follows the evidence, not the assumptions. By closing arguments, there were effectively two different men sitting inside the same case. The prosecution's Michael Jackson was a predator who used his celebrity, his money, and his access to children to commit crimes. Sneddon's team told jurors not to be blinded by fame. They argued that the accuser's inconsistencies didn't erase the core allegation, that victims of abuse often struggle to tell their stories cleanly. And they insisted that the earlier allegations showed a pattern the jury couldn't responsibly ignore. The defense's Michael Jackson was a different figure entirely. Eccentric, yes. Naive about how his behavior appeared to the outside world, possibly. A man whose boundaries with children looked deeply inappropriate to most adults. Mesereau didn't waste energy fighting that. What he fought was the leap from inappropriate to criminal. He argued that unusual behavior is not proof of molestation. He portrayed the Arvizo family as unreliable people who had learned how to extract help from celebrities and institutions, and whose story had changed too many times, in too many directions, to carry the weight of a criminal conviction. The prosecution returned to pain and accusation. The defense returned to credibility and doubt. And on June 3rd, Judge Melville finished instructing the jury. 8 women, 4 men, 14 weeks of testimony behind them, more than 100 witnesses, thousands of pages of evidence. The lawyers stopped talking. The jurors left the courtroom, and Michael Jackson could do nothing but wait. The first day of deliberations lasted only a couple of hours before the weekend interrupted. Then the jury returned, and the world began a slow, agonizing wait. Every time the courthouse doors opened, reporters watched for a signal. Every time Jackson's convoy moved through Santa Maria, cameras followed from above and beside. News anchors speculated, legal commentators argued, fans held vigil, and 12 jurors worked through testimony from roughly 140 witnesses in a room no camera could enter. They eventually spent about 32 hours deliberating across 7 days. And then, shortly after midday on June 13th, word reached Judge Melville. They had verdicts. Everything accelerated. Jackson had to return to court. His family arrived. Fans began screaming outside the courthouse. News organizations across the world interrupted programming. Anchors broke into live coverage. Helicopters circled overhead. Inside the courtroom, the jurors took their seats. Jackson sat at the defense table, Mesereau beside him. Then the clerk began reading. Count 1, the conspiracy charge, involving allegations of child abduction, false imprisonment, and extortion. Not guilty. The molestation counts. Not guilty. One after another. Not guilty. The attempted lewd act count. Not guilty. The alcohol-related counts. Not guilty. 10 charges. 10 acquittals. As the verdicts continued, Jackson began dabbing at his eyes with a tissue. The man who had entered that courtroom facing the possibility of years in prison was hearing the state lose every single count it had brought to the jury. Then it was over. His bail was exonerated. He was free to leave. But the most revealing explanation of what happened inside that jury room wouldn't come from Michael Jackson, or from Mesereau, or from Sneddon. It came from the jurors themselves. Afterward, several jurors spoke publicly, and what they said was important, because it wasn't what many people expected to hear. They weren't saying that every decision Michael Jackson had ever made was wise. Several jurors openly expressed discomfort with his practice of sharing beds or bedrooms with children. They weren't defending his lifestyle. They weren't calling him a role model. What they kept returning to was the prosecution's burden. Beyond a reasonable doubt, for these 12 people, after 32 hours of deliberation across 7 days, the evidence hadn't reached that standard. Several jurors were especially critical of the accuser's mother. They had watched her testimony closely. They questioned her credibility. They described behavior from her on the witness stand that troubled them, and they said the weakness they perceived in the family's testimony affected how they evaluated the entire case. Not just the conspiracy charge, but the molestation counts as well. One juror put it simply: they had expected stronger evidence. Something they could hold on to firmly, and it never arrived. That distinction between "we believe he's innocent" and "the prosecution didn't prove its case" is the one that gets lost every time a famous trial becomes a cultural argument. A jury doesn't have to admire the defendant. It doesn't have to approve of how the defendant lives. It has criminal charges in front of it, and a legal standard those charges have to meet. On June 13, 2005, 12 jurors unanimously concluded that standard hadn't been met. Some people saw the acquittal as proof that Jackson had been falsely accused. Others believed serious questions about his behavior and his relationships with children remained unanswered. Questions a not guilty verdict could not erase. The courtroom had settled the criminal charges. The argument over Michael Jackson continued, as if the verdict had never been read. When Jackson emerged from the courthouse, the noise was enormous. Supporters celebrated. Cameras locked onto him. His family stayed close. But Jackson himself looked drained. This wasn't the Michael Jackson who exploded onto a stage under spotlights and commanded 60,000 people with a single gesture. There was no moonwalk, no speech, no raised fist, no victory performance. After 14 weeks of testimony, a parade of witnesses, intense cross-examinations, a medical emergency, the pajama-bottom morning, celebrity denials, old allegations resurface, new allegations challenged, fingerprint evidence, publication dates, a mother whose credibility collapsed under questioning, and 7 days of silence from a jury that held one man's entire future in their hands. The case had ended with one repeated phrase: "Not guilty," 10 times. Michael Jackson entered that courtroom facing the possibility that one of the most extraordinary careers in entertainment history would end with a criminal conviction and a prison sentence. On June 13, 2005, he walked out a free man. But he didn't walk back into the world he'd occupied before the trial began. Months of allegations had been broadcast around the planet. The most private details of his life had been examined in open court. Neverland, the place he'd built as an escape from the world, had become permanently inseparable from controversy. And millions of people who had never met him, never entered that courtroom, never heard a single witness under oath, had spent 4 months deciding what they believed about Michael Jackson. The jury had the legal answer. The world was never going to agree on the rest, and that may be why the 2005 trial remains one of the most defining chapters of Michael Jackson's life. It wasn't simply a celebrity spectacle. It was the moment when fame, suspicion, criminal law, media obsession, witness credibility, and one man's freedom collided inside a single courtroom. And for 14 weeks, the entire planet watched, while 12 ordinary people tried to find the truth underneath all of it. They delivered their answer, not guilty, on every count. Whether the world accepted that answer is a different story entirely. If you remember watching this trial unfold in 2005, I want to know, what did you believe then, and does hearing the full courtroom story change how you see the verdict now? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more carefully researched stories about the moments that shaped Michael Jackson's life, beyond the headlines, like this video, and subscribe. Because behind every famous photograph, every interview, every controversy, and every performance, there's usually a much bigger story than the one the world remembers. That's what we'll keep telling here.